Second panel discussion is going to be looking at more day-to-day life and issues around workplace and employers' accessibility and all that kind of thing. So I just wanted to introduce everybody firstly, and then we'll get to introductions. I'm joined by Joan Carthy from Irish Wheelchair Association, Christabelle Feeney from Employers for Change, Paralympian swimmer Patrick Flanagan, Maeve Monaghan from Now Group, and next to Maeve we have Fergus Sharpe from Dublin Chamber. So Joan, do you want to just give us a little, will we do the same thing? We'll have a little introduction and find out where everyone is coming from. So will you start for me, please? Yeah,
sure. I'm the National Advocacy Manager with Irish Wheelchair Association, and I suppose my first introduction to disability was when I had a road traffic accident when I was 21, so over 30 years ago. And I got involved, I was a co-founder for Spinal Injuries Ireland, and in that space I suppose there was a lot of roles that I played, but a lot of it was working with people who are newly injured and their family members, and trying to kind of give them the understanding of what it was like to live with an injury, and I suppose really for them to see what the possibilities were to live with an injury. I worked there for about 20 years, but really felt that there was more I could do if I could work, I suppose, on the bigger stage, looking at policy, trying to influence policy and make changes there. And that's where my work began with Irish Wheelchair Association about 6 years ago. So I suppose in this arena, I sit on the Access Board, the Transport Access Committee, with the department, and I also would be on other user groups in relation to transport. So I'd have a wide, I suppose, knowledge of transport, not from a user point of view only, but kind of the policy side of things and looking at seeing what way things are changing. But I suppose for today's piece, it's really kind of looking at trying to look outside the box. We keep looking at what needs to be put in place in relation to making the buses accessible and all of those, and trains accessible. But it's actually the step beyond that. It's the impact that access to transport has on employment, education, and all the other pieces of I suppose, life and how we interact in life.
Yeah, fun, sports, all those kind of things. Christabelle, will you give us a little introduction about where you're from?
Yes, of course. As you said, my name is Christabelle Feeney, and just to give a physical descriptor of myself, I'm a white female with long blonde hair and blue eyes, and today I'm wearing a black turtleneck top and skirt. So as you mentioned, I'm the Director of Employers for Change at the Open Doors Initiative. We're a project that's funded by the Department of Children, Equality, Disability, Integration and Youth, and we launched in March of last year. So our purpose really is to act as a support and advice service in the area of disability inclusion for employers around Ireland. And we would give advice to employers on things like reasonable accommodations, the supports and grants that are available through the Department of Social Protection to them, and other things such as conversations around kind of disclosure when somebody comes within the organisation and shares with a colleague or an employer that they have a disability, and how to approach those conversations and ensure that you're acting as a support to that individual throughout their work cycle or life cycle within the working environment. So we do a lot of work in the area of disability awareness training with employers. We have a helpline as well that employers can use free of charge if they do want to access any advice or information. And all of that is on our website, employersforchange.ie. So it's great for us to be involved in the conversation today. This is a wonderful event. And as Joan mentioned there, accessibility, it goes across the board. It's really important for people. We're talking obviously predominantly this morning about transport and access to transport, but there's such a knock-on effect from that into other aspects of people's lives, be that economic inclusion in terms of, the workplace environment and access to work, but also the social aspect as well, and actually being part of the social fabric of society is important for all of us as individuals. So thanks very much for having us here today.
Yeah, well, we're delighted to have you. Patrick, will you give us a little introduction, please?
Yeah, so as you said, my name is Patrick Flanagan. I'm an Irish Paralympic swimmer. I've been lucky enough to travel most of the world with my swimming. I've competed at 2 European Championships, a World Championship, and then the Paralympic Games in Tokyo last summer. I grew up in Longford in the middle of Ireland, so I had to go through that change of kind of moving out of rural Ireland and moving up to Dublin and dealing with that acclimatization to the city, which was something quite easy for so many of my peers my age who didn't have to deal with the challenges of being a wheelchair user in the city. And that kind of opened my eyes to life, in the city as a wheelchair user and kind of what needs to happen, what needs to change.
Great. Maeve?
Yes, I'm delighted to be here. I'm Maeve Monaghan. I'm the Chief Executive of the Now Group, based or born, as I say, in Belfast, but working across the island of Ireland now. And we support about 1,200 people with intellectual disabilities and autism into Jobs with Future. And I'm really keen to be here today because we're talking about a jam card initiative which was set up really by our participants who decided that one of the reasons why they didn't access their cities and their towns, or in many cases work, was because they just couldn't get there or they didn't feel confident to get there. So I'll talk a little bit more later about jam card, particularly in relation to people with hidden disabilities and that aspect around customer service.
Great, thank you. And Fergus Sharpe.
Sure, I'm Fergus Sharpe, Head of Public Affairs at Dublin Chamber. We're the representative body for businesses in the Greater Dublin area. It's a very wide, diverse membership base, everything from sole traders and small startups to large multinationals and semi-state companies. What they're all united by, though, is a vision of Dublin that has both business competitiveness and quality of life at its core, understanding that those two things are really complementary. Mobility and transport is absolutely key to that. And we've been strong advocates for more investment in public transport and improvements to our transport infrastructure for a long time now. But in recent years, the conversation has really shifted in I think, a quite focused way to broader improvements to the public realm in general, and making sure that public transport, as well as our streetscapes in general, are accessible to people with all levels of mobility, ability or disability. So delighted to be here today. 1 in 7 Irish people, according to the last census, or at least the 2016 census, has some kind of a disability, and well over 250,000 of them, that's a substantial physical limitation of some kind. So it's really important that we're ambitious about this if we want to create an inclusive labour market and an inclusive economy and society.
Great. Well, listen, it's wonderful to have you all here. I might start with you, Patrick. You talked about that quintessential Irish experience of being a culture coming up to the big smoke and the challenges that faced. What was it like for you adjusting to Dublin?
Yeah, so it was obviously very tough. My first real experience of it was when I was 16. I was in transition year in school, and I just gotten this great work experience in the centre of Dublin, and I was obviously really excited for it. So I kind of sat down the week before with my mum, and we figured out my big week in Dublin, how I was going to get up and down to Longford each day, and what time I was going to get on the train. I was going to get the train up to Connolly and then the Dart into the centre. And luckily, my mum is the kind of person that will not leave anything up to chance. So she made sure she came with me on day one. And our challenges started straight away, almost at Longford train station, when we had to go chasing people to try and make sure there was a ramp there for us. I realise now you're meant to book the train in advance, but none of my siblings have disabilities, so that was nothing my mum had dealt with before, which is quite frustrating. That's something I would have to do just because I'm in a wheelchair. So we got up to Dublin, and then once again had to go find a ramp to get me off a train, and we try and take the Dart, and it's just not happening. There's no way for me to get on the train. So luckily we go asking public people beside us just to help lift me and throw me up there, and it was really just degrading and frustrating because I realised really quickly that my big week in Dublin wasn't going to be my week in Dublin. I wasn't going to be independent. For the rest of the week, my mum had to go back to work, so it was a case where I was organising with cousins of mine who are already up in Dublin that they were going to meet me with some of their friends, ride the Dart with me, lift me on and off, and I realised I just had no independence to this great adventure that I wanted to go on. I still had a great time on work experience, but there was definitely this overhanging frustration to it. And then a couple of years later, when I went to college, I moved up to UCD, and I had quite a negative perception of what it was going to be like getting around Dublin. And luckily, I realised there are some things that do work. Realising that I can still get the bus into town with my friends. The ramps that fold out, there are some positives, and these are good things. But the challenge is the consistency. So, for example, you know that you're going to get a ramp onto the bus, but there mightn't be space when you get on there. And that's why so many people with disabilities are so frustrated, because there's these protocols and there's these expectations, and there's great stuff on websites about how it's going to work out, but it's just not always the case. So you might even get a Dart that's meant to be a wheelchair accessible station, but you get there and the lift doesn't work. And you don't take that risk because the trust isn't there. And until we get that level of trust and that level of consistency, I don't think we're going to see people with disabilities taking public transport regularly.
Yeah, God, it's so difficult. Like when you should be just going to work. You should be having a great time. You should be going, I'm going to Google to play the foosball tables at my break, or whatever people in Google do. Obviously much more than that. But I suppose, like Joan, he's painting a picture for us about how many challenges they are. But like in terms of employment and workplaces, like what are the misconceptions that employers have about hiring people with disabilities?
Yeah, I think people with disabilities, I suppose, have been portrayed very negatively over the years in relation to employment and education and what their capabilities are. And in many cases, and in most cases, people with disabilities are well able to take up employment and work alongside their peers at the same level and the same pace as they can. I think there's also a perception that if an employer looks to take on somebody with a disability, there's a huge amount of cost to that. Whether it's putting in reasonable accommodation, so they might look at having to change their premises or whatever. In a lot of cases, especially with the newer buildings, you know, a lot of the structure is there already, it's fine. And most people only need small adaptations. And there are grants out there as well. There's government grants out there that people or that employers can apply for to help in that. So straight away, I think we're on the back foot with employers because they think it's going to be a big deal to take on somebody with a disability, rather than them bringing them as far as the interview, having that conversation, figuring out what it is that somebody needs, and then working to find the best way to work it. Because the other side of it is that what's coming across in statistics is that people with disabilities, when they are in employment, they're actually out sick less because they have that drive, they want to prove, they'll turn up at work even when they're unwell. So there's the whole other side of, I suppose, the positive impacts that people can have, not only on the actual work that they do, but on their peers around them.
Yeah, and obviously clearly problem solvers and able to work in tricky situations
Absolutely,
all the time.
Because we're solving problems every day of our lives.
Yeah. And Christabelle, I see you nodding along there as with your organisation, Employers for Change. Like, is what Joan is saying? Are you hearing that similarly?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say one of the biggest barriers for employers is lack of maybe understanding and lack of knowledge. And when you don't have an understanding or you don't have knowledge of anything, you're always fearful of it. So I think that employers, as Joan said, there's a little bit of fear there, about the unknown, maybe not understanding what kind of reasonable accommodations might be required. And like, as Joan mentioned there, the accommodations often don't even have a cost. So in the last couple of years, AHEAD have carried out research and they found that actually 2/3 of the cost, or 2/3 of reasonable accommodations requested to employers had no cost at all. And then the other 1/3 actually had minimal cost because they're often available within the organisation. So it comes back again to us when we think about disability. Are we understanding the diversity of disability itself? Are we understanding that you can have visible disabilities, but you can also have hidden disabilities? And even for the employers out there who might be working, let's say, in an environment like a listed building or something that maybe right now isn't wheelchair accessible, that doesn't mean that you can't be inclusive of people with disabilities. There are also other disabilities that people are living with out there. So it's really getting the employers to understand and be more confident and be disability confident in themselves, that actually they feel that they can be inclusive and that they understand that there are things that all of us can do on a day-to-day basis to be more inclusive of people with disabilities within our organisations. And
do you have examples of like what companies are doing right?
Yeah, I suppose the first thing I'd say to that is people always ask us, have you got a gold standard of what an organisation is doing? And I'd always be cautious with that because companies are doing lots of great work, but there's no one organisation doing it perfectly because this is a very diverse space that we're talking about. We all have different needs as individuals, and people with disabilities are the same. They all have very different needs and have different disabilities, and there's huge diversity in that. But some of the examples I would give, one that jumps out is the likes of Bank of Ireland, who've been doing a lot of work. They've introduced what's called a reasonable accommodation passport within their organisation. It's a document that was put together by IBEC and the Irish Congress of Trade Unions a couple of years ago. And the idea is that there'd be this kind of live document within an organisation where a person can raise with their manager that they have a reasonable accommodation need. And this document goes with that person throughout their time in the organisation. So if, for example, they were to change roles or their manager changes, they don't have to consistently ask for that accommodation. That now stays with that person, and it creates kind of an open discussion and a process. So Bank of Ireland have actually introduced that for all staff across the board. So for example, let's say you're somebody who's primary carer for an individual. You can now go and ask to have your working hours adjusted. So it really shows our employees across the board that accessibility and inclusion, it's good for everyone. So what might be effective in the initial term for people with disabilities is effective for everybody.
Yeah.
And the only other example I'd give is the likes of Salesforce. They have been really good in terms of the creation of their job specs. So again, they include in their job specs, they include information around the physical environment where the job is taking place, so that a person has a very clear picture on application of the type of environment they're going to be working in, and also the physical movement requirements of a role. And I think that's really helpful for people when they're applying for roles, that there's no ambiguity, that they've a full understanding of the requirements related to it.
Yeah, and it's building it into the culture. It's like, we do this here, we think about these things. Maeve, your job is all about supporting people with intellectual disabilities and autism into jobs for the future. So what do you think we can do to be more inclusive of people with intellectual disabilities?
I think part of the solution is the events like today, where we start to talk about it and we talk about the opportunities rather than the problems all the time. I suppose I reflect in being in this industry now for nearly 20 years and seeing the difference in the conversation that's happening more recently. In very early days in Now Group, it was really difficult to encourage employers. You were doing it one at a time. And the concern I had at that time was that when they were looking at appointing somebody with a disability, it nearly was a CSR piece rather than the right person for the job. And I think that's changed because the labour market has changed. And businesses need really good people, and they're starting to realise the business case of diversity and inclusion. And I think that conversation has opened up something new. So, we're finding that businesses are particularly interested in disabled people as an amazing group of people that can add value to their organisations. I think sometimes, as a previous speaker said, there's just a little bit of a fear of getting it wrong, so they don't do anything. And lots of talking about the examples of things that have worked really well from an employer's point of view and also from a staff point of view definitely helps break down some of those barriers and, helps businesses get on with it.
Yeah.
Because I haven't heard one employer that hasn't said that it's been better for business in the longer term, and that it not only does it make it more inclusive of their customer base, but it's just primarily good for business.
And it's also just the right thing to do.
Yeah, it's a no-brainer, really. It's that piece around getting going. And the support that's required to do it well and make sure that we tell the stories about where it's worked and fix the problems if it hasn't. And
tell me about the Jam card and how that fits into kind of helping with this awareness.
Yeah, well, I suppose that's probably one of the main reasons why I'm here today, because, as we'd spoken about before, there's quite a significant amount of people in the population who it's not very evident that they have a disability, and access to goods and services can be limited by just a fear of not getting it right. So the Jam card started off with a group of our participants with intellectual disabilities and autism who were particularly nervous about getting on buses. So when we asked them, why aren't you accessing the city? Why aren't you going to jobs? The fear of getting onto a bus just limited everything. And that was, I always use the example of if you're going to a country that you've never been in before and you can't speak the language, and there's all of these norms that nobody ever tells you. There's no guidebook that tells you this is how you ask for a seat, this is how it works when you get on. That's all just assumed. And for some of the participants that we were supporting, the fear of getting that wrong just stopped. So the Jam card stands for Just a Minute. So I think it's a perfect example of a product, a really simple solution that was designed by people who needed it themselves. I didn't realise that it was a problem. I would have never come up with that solution. But our participants did, because that's what they needed. And all they asked for is just a minute. It just stops at that point of fear and says, just give me a minute. Might take me a little bit more time to say where I'm going or get my money out but that's okay. And I think that's what's been amazing. We've had great support from Free Now and Bus Erin and Dublin Bus. And that's rolled out across the transport network across the island of Ireland. 95,000 Jam card users now, and that increasing every day. So I think that shows the spending power of people with disabilities, and I think that changes the conversation with business.
Yeah, big time. And Fergus, what Maeve is saying there and what others are saying, is that kind of chiming with what you're hearing from your members in Dublin Chamber?
Absolutely. I think Maeve is right that, businesses, the labour market is changing. So businesses are very keen, I think, to really take on board all the fantastic talent that is out there, including people with all sorts of different mobility levels and abilities and disabilities. And often the misconception isn't necessarily about whether somebody would be able to do the job. It's about whether, us as a business, whether we would be able to accommodate them. And as Christabelle says, I think, a lot of the job we have really is about raising awareness of the support that is out there, the fact that there isn't necessarily an outlay involved, but that if there is, there are fantastic supports out there at the moment that could really make a real difference. I'm going to talk about just one or two of them by way of example. One that I think probably all businesses should be aware of, because it could be almost universally applicable, is the support scheme for disability awareness training, right? Which is very simple, just helping staff and management understand how disabilities work, the different kinds of disabilities that there are, giving them an overview of anti-discrimination and equal opportunities legislation, doing perceptual awareness exercises to sort of dispel some of the misconceptions that people have. That's covered by the government in a grant that covers up to 90% of the cost of that over a number of years, up to a maximum of €2,000 or €20,000, I beg your pardon. So it's quite substantial. And if something happens to an employee, just thinking of the really moving story we heard earlier in the last hour, if something happens a key employee, or indeed an employee at any level in an organisation, in any occupation, there's a grant available to help you retain that employee in the role that they were in. And that's a two-stage process. It involves getting in an external specialist to develop a specific strategy for that employee to help them be retained. And then a second stage of support is implementing that strategy. So that could be hiring a job coach, training or retraining the employee to deal with their role now in the context of their disability, or potentially retraining for another role within the organisation. And again, most of the cost of that will be covered by the grant that's available. There's also supports available for workplace equipment, adaptation of the workplace, whether that's minor modifications to buildings, ramps, different bathroom facilities and so on. There's a huge amount of support out there. So I think raising awareness of that would really help to open things up and allow businesses to take advantage of all the talent that is out there.
Or even just simple things of businesses putting on their website and social media, we have an accessible toilet, we have a ramp, these things, we're here, we're open and ready to accept everybody, come spend your money with us. Like, Joan, do you think, I kind of think I know the answer to this, but what is it that we need to do? Is it tighter legislation to compel people to do things? Is it greater awareness? Is it like a revamp of the physical infrastructure? Is it all of it?
Yes, and yes.
I kind of thought that.
Yeah. There's so many things, I suppose, that really needs to be done. There does need to be tighter legislation. There's obviously we have the 6% quota that's after being brought in for public bodies, but that has to be, or some type of quota has to be brought into the private sector as well. I think it's, I suppose, just kind of pulling a couple of things together from what we were talking about, and obviously this is a transport conference, so I suppose looking at the transport and the employment side of things, I mean, they go hand in hand, but I think it's everybody's responsibility in relation to transport, and not taken away from the government, because absolutely that's where it sits with. But we also have to look at kind of what's happening in rural Ireland, and no matter how well our infrastructure is, there's going to be so many people that transport's not going to reach to. So it's all about the employers and the companies looking at how they can play a part in actually getting people into their companies to work if they're living in a rural setting. We've all seen how well it works to work remotely for people with disabilities, like everybody else is doing it now. So that's kind of bringing people with disabilities now into the workforce. It's opening it up to them. But it's not to say that we want people with disabilities only working from home. So it's how those companies can maybe get involved much more in that transport discussion beyond today, to see, is there anything that they can do to open it up, especially if they are in rural settings. So it's a much bigger piece than just saying it needs to be more, kind of stronger legislation. It's a bigger conversation.
Yeah. And Christabelle, what are the positive impacts that come to businesses and communities when they are more inclusive?
Yeah, so look, I know it's been mentioned here about the positive business case for it. And like we're talking about a community globally that's over 1 billion people. And when you're taking into consideration family and friends, the disabled community has a spending power of 11 trillion euro. So that's a huge market share of our communities that businesses need to tap into. But as well as that, the Deloitte carried out their diversity and inclusion report in 2020, and they found that companies that had a truly inclusive culture, they were 8 times more likely to have positive business outcomes, they were 6 times more likely to be innovative and agile, and they were 3 times more likely to be high performing. So there's such a strong business case. We've all talked here about the abilities of people with disabilities. We're talking about people who often have to navigate life in a much more complex way than the non-disabled community. And as a result, are fantastic problem solvers, brilliant organisers. And so this is really a talent pool of individuals that as employers we can't afford to miss out on. And from a community perspective, I suppose, look, economically, there's obviously the knock-on effect of we have people in employment, they have access to money. It means better physical and mental well-being for people. But a huge part is that element of social inclusion. And we've all learnt over the last kind of 24 months from maybe working remotely, that need for feeling like we're part of something, that we have people that we're going to speak to every day. And the social aspect of actually being included in the workplace is huge for people. We carried out research at the end of last year looking at the impact of remote working during COVID-19 on people with disabilities. And of course, it can be a much more attractive opportunity for people with disabilities because obviously access to transport, that issue can be removed if you're working remotely. But what we can't forget is it shouldn't ever be an alternative to providing reasonable accommodations, and it shouldn't be an opportunity for people with disabilities to be isolated from the rest of the workforce. So there's a real need as we move into this kind of new world of remote and hybrid working that we're consistently connecting all of our staff, all of our employees, both those with disabilities and without, that we're connecting them together, that we're ensuring that we're providing accommodations, that we do not assume that our work or our home lives are equipped to act as our office or our workplaces, and that we're providing things like captioning for all of our events, and that we're asking people, do they have an accommodation need for their continuous learning and development within our organisation?
Great. And listen, Fergus, we're kind of running out of time, but just very briefly, you spoke about supports that exist already, but what are the other key policy areas where we need to do better or where there needs to be improvements?
I think something that the Chamber has been campaigning on over the last year or two in particular has been the vision of the 15-minute city. So designing Dublin as a city in which within 15 minutes of active travel from your home, whether that's cycling, walking, wheelchair use, you've access to all the key facilities and services you need for local living and to support the local economy, getting all that integrated into local authority development plans, and we're seeing progress on that. I think leveraging the National Development Plan, which is the biggest capital investment programme in infrastructure in the history of the state, making sure that universal design principles are integrated into all those developments from a very early stage. And I suppose the third thing maybe would be harnessing new technologies in a really targeted way, like mobility as a service, making sure that government and state agencies maybe engage in a proactive way with mass providers to try and develop solutions for the kind of transport mix we're hoping to see in Dublin over the next kind of few decades.
Great. Well, it's brilliant to hear that there's so much in progress and in train, and I think the next 10 years will probably be quite transformative, says she optimistically. But Patrick, I might leave you with the last thought of the day, no pressure, but what do you think as a young person, what do you want people to take home from today's conference?
Yeah, I think it's just that disability is such a broad word, and then consequently so is accessibility. So if you're sitting at home today and you want to get more involved in accessibility, which hopefully you do after watching this conference, just don't be afraid. Just include people with disabilities in the conversation. Yeah. Reach out to the organisations that have spoken here today and just start that process, because the sooner we start, the sooner we can get to a place where we actually have long-term and sustainable accessibility, and we can include people with disabilities in our society long-term, which is ultimately what everyone really wants.
Yeah, ultimately what everyone wants. Well, listen, thank you all for your input. It was so useful to kind of hear concrete examples of, how to make transport and the wider world more accessible, and then get an idea of the hurdles to overcome, and they are unfortunately still many. But also get a sense that this is all achievable, and in fact it must be achieved, and that greater awareness of the wider public of the obstacles faced by people with a disability, along with the greater commitment and prioritisation by companies, businesses and governments, will help to ensure access for everyone, everywhere. I'm sure this isn't the end of the conversation, and I'll see you in some other fora somewhere else, but thank you again for your time today.